Hello everyone, I'm Carlos from Walk21, and this is the second session for the Step Up project, where we are presenting the 8 steps framework to develop. Remind you what we saw in our first meeting and the first session that we had in Burgenland, Austria, where Jim Walker presented the 8 steps framework for the first time, and he talked about the importance of commitment, research, involvement, assessment, review, plan, proof, and investment, which are the 8 steps, and the main topics for each of the sessions that we will have. The first session in Burgenland was about commitment from stakeholders, and this session in our visit to Braga in Portugal will be about walkability research. After that, the next session that we will have in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, will be about involvement from citizens. So basically, these 8 steps are a prerequisite for your cities and regions to either improve existing policies on walkability or to develop new walking policies. These 8 steps will help you set specific goals and objectives for the policies, such as increasing walking activity, improving safety, and so on. They will also guide you to set the necessary actions and interventions focused on people, places, and processes. And eventually, they will also hopefully give you some positive outcomes and impacts in your cities and regions. So today, we're talking about research, and I wanted to start this presentation with this graph showing the research publications on walkability since the year 2000. So there are two things you can see here, that at the beginning of the graph there are virtually no publications. That doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't any studies on walkability already. There were many, but the term walkability was not popular yet. And another thing is that most of the studies on walking were not peer-reviewed or they were not published on scientific journals. Another thing that we can see is that the publications on walkability are increasing almost exponentially, because if you see, I couldn't add in this graph the year 2024, but it's much higher than the previous one, and I expect the 2025 to have even more publications, because walkability, it's a research topic that is increasing in many different fields, not only transport, but also urban studies, health studies, studies related to sustainable development, and many more. So what we can see is that because there weren't many research on walkability before the year 2010, more or less, most of the policies ignored walking or walkability. Most of the transport policies ignore walkability. And this resulted in car-oriented and car-dependent cities and regions. But this is, as you see that studies on walkability are increasing at the moment, they're also the importance of walking and walkability are also increasing in transport policies. And there are some specific walking policies now, which is the case of some of your cities and regions. This topic of walkability research is rather extensive and complex sometimes, and we have limited time for this presentation. So the aim of the presentation is going to be to present to you some key concepts and also some tools and methods related to walkability research. But I won't go into detail. So if you have any questions, if you want to learn more about some of the things I'm going to present today, or if you want us, Walk 21, to help you with some specific things that I'm going to present today, please let us know, reach out, and we can have some separate meetings to discuss about some specific concepts. After this presentation, I encourage you to test this, to go to Google and search for the most walkable place in the world or the most pedestrian city in the world, and you will find dozens of different results with different lists of the top 10 or top 5 cities. None of the list will have the same cities, and none of the list will have the same order. And this doesn't necessarily mean that these websites are lying. What happens here is that each of these lists are using a different definition for what a walkable city is. They are using different ways of measuring walkability, and they have different indicators. So depending on your definition of walkability and how you measure it, you will have different results. And this is also the case for your policies, for your walkability or walking policies. The way you define and measure walkability will determine the purpose and the commitments of your policy, but also how you implement and evaluate it. And this thing about defining walkability is something that researchers have been dealing with for the last 2 decades. If you look at the current research literature on walkability, you might find dozens of different definitions as well. Even though walkability, the term walkability is being increasingly used everywhere, there is no universal definition for walkability, and that has good and bad things. Normally researchers tend to choose one specific definition, or they develop their own definition to suit their specific needs or aims for the study. And as a result, you can find many different definitions of what walkability means. For this step-up project, which is more focused on policy than research, we propose you a definition that could be something like the last one you see at the bottom. So a walkable city enables and encourages everyone to walk regularly and have a safe, accessible, comfortable and enjoyable walking experience. So this is a definition that can be useful for a walking policy. But when researchers find this kind of complex concepts, and they want to define them and they want to measure them, there is a research framework that helps you to do so, and it's this kind of conceptual definition, operational definition, and computational definition. It's like a process in which you start to better understand a complex concept like walkability. Basically, you need to set or establish a concept. What is walkability? Then you need a practical definition, which normally is a series of smaller components or characteristics that define that. So you can define walkability, then find smaller components of walkability, and then the last computational or methodological definition helps you to actually measure these things, either with formulas or with ratings, and you can get a variable. You can get things that you can add a value to. So in this visit to Braga, we've been discussing or talking a lot about quality of life. Just to give you another example. And quality of life is also a complex concept, which is hard to define and also hard to measure and so on. So for example, the WHO, let me read that because I don't know it by heart, but the WHO has a definition for quality of life, which is an individual's an individual's perception of their position in life in the context of the culture and value system in which they live, and in relation to their goals, expectations, standards, and concerns. So here you have at least a definition that people can agree on, and it's a starting point to be able to measure it. After they define what quality of life means, they propose a list of indicators. So quality of life, it's related to wealth, related to employment, environment, physical and mental health, the education, the leisure time, safety and security, freedom, and other things. And now that WHO lists some indicators, they come up with actual formulas or variables to be able to measure those. So for example, wealth could be measured by the savings or incomes of the family. Employment could be rated by, I don't know, the status within the company or the type of company you work for, and so on. And you can do that for all of them, all of the indicators. Then you end up with specific values that you can measure and compare. So going back to walkability, this is something that you need to have into consideration for your policies. One relevant consideration for walking or walkability policies is that the way, as I said before, the way you define walkability will determine the aims and objectives and so on for the policies. And another relevant thing is that each concept that you include in your definition for walkability needs to be measured or assessed. So if you have a definition including specific terms, you need to make sure you are able to measure those terms. For the specific case of walking policies, you should be able to understand the current situation of your city or your region. So you need to be able to measure the things that you are interested in, and then you need to be able to use the same system to measure these things after the policy is implemented, so that you can assess the impact of your policy. So just going back to the idea of walkability, a theoretical and simple theoretical definition could be, for walkability, could be the quality of the public space for pedestrians. In a practical definition, you need to break down walkability in smaller concepts. So maybe the quality of the public space is based on how safe, how accessible, how comfortable this place is for pedestrians. And then for the methodological definition, you need to be able to actually measure safety, to measure accessibility, and so on. So for example, for safety, you can look into traffic accidents with pedestrian casualties, or you can look into the number of pedestrian crossings or the traffic speed in one street, and so on. These will be specific variables. So now we're going to see how researchers have dealt with defining and measuring walkability, and I wanted to give you a very old example. Back in the 70s, some transport engineers were already trying to quantify or categorize pedestrian infrastructure. In this case, using what it's called the level of service. So, as I said at the beginning, because there weren't many studies on walking and walkability, what happened at the very beginning of this topic is that a lot of researchers were using methodologies from transport, from cars, and applied them to pedestrians. So these first steps were just looking into walking flow, let's say. The level of service were based on space, capacity, volume of pedestrians, and walking flows, and that's all. But then, as this concept evolved into the pedestrian level of services around the year 2000, they started to be more based on quality rather than just quantity, and they started to include more elements of the public space, such as the buildings, the greenery, the crossings, and so on. The pedestrian level of services looked at the quality of the environment, as I said, and they started to use qualitative scales. So I don't know if you can see in this table where I near to me, near me, um, they assessed different elements of the public space with specific values, in which, for example, 5 means excellent, 4 good, 3 average, 2 poor, and 1 very poor. So they were giving qualitative data, or they will give qualitative values to specific elements of the public space. Um, this is a first attempt to measure walkability somehow, or the walkable environment. However, there was a lot of disparity in research, and each study looked at different elements of the public space, and they categorized them with different scales. So it was really hard to compare studies and to build knowledge on previous research. So what happened at this point is that some researchers came up with an attempt for a universal definition of walkability and a systematic way of define and measure walkability. So this is a very well-known approach, which is based on urban density, urban diversity, and street design. It's called the 3Ds. And it's basically based on the idea of walking proximity to destinations and opportunities. So in 2005, Frank and colleagues started to study that places or urban places which are more dense, um, they have different diversity of land use, and they have specific street design will be better for accessing places on foot. Basically, if a city is more compact, um, there are closer things to walk. If the land use is diverse, you have different places to reach, a variety of places to reach. And if the street connectivity is direct, you can get to those destinations easier. So what they did is they followed this approach that I told you about, the conceptual, operational, and computational definition, and said, okay, what determines a walkable environment is the density, diversity of and design of the urban space or the urban fabric. Now we're going to use an operational definition, and density is going to be based on the residential density. Diversity is based on the land use mix, so the different activities in the city. And design is based on the street connectivity. And now that we have the indicators, we're going to go to the computational definition, and we are going to propose a specific formula or a value that we can use to measure these things. So for residential density, they look into the number of residential units per square kilometer. For the land use mix, they have a land use entropy, which is a kind of formula that looks into whether a place has residential, commercial, office, recreational areas, and so on, and come up with a value from 0 to 100. And street connectivity was measured by the number of intersections per square kilometer. So the more intersections in one area, the more direct you can access places on foot. This was really successful, and it was the backbone of the first walkability index, which is used in a lot of research and is used at the moment also. But it's also an approach that is criticized because it somehow oversimplifies walkability into just walking proximity. It ignores safety, comfort, and other things, and it's like a macro scale approach. It's only looking into the urban fabric, but it doesn't look into what happens in the actual street, for example. It's an approach that works in North America, in the North America context. So Canada, United States. It also works in Australia, in places with a lot of suburbs and separate urban zoning, which it's a it's an issue for walkability. But it doesn't really work in the European context and in other contexts such as South America, Africa, or Asia. So what happened is that after this innovative way of measuring walkability, other researchers in Europe came up with different conceptual definitions with more complex concepts, and they also found a way to operationalize them and to measure them. So this is an example actually from Portuguese researchers, now that we are in Braga, um, and they proposed the 7 Cs. So they looked into connectivity, convenience, comfort, conviviality, conspicuousness, coexistence, and commitment. Um, to be honest, I think they were looking for words starting with C just to have a catchy name, the 7 Cs, but some of them might be a little bit confusing. For example, coexistence is just looking into safety, let's say, because the operational definition for coexistence is looking at traffic safety and also pedestrian crossings. Um, One relevant thing of this approach is that it's not only looking at street scale, so they look about they consider the pavement quality, they consider the crossings and so on, but they also add in this main concept of commitment that looks into law enforcement and also the use of design standards and so on, which is not part of the built environment, it's more part about the necessary processes and capacity building that a city needs to be able to have a good walkability. And just one last example about this approach, it's the walking needs. Um, so after this, many researchers came up with the idea of the walking needs, kind of a pyramid of walking needs. Basically, it says that in order for a person to choose to walk or to be able to walk, that walk or the environment where the person walks needs to be feasible, convenient, accessible, safe, comfortable, pleasant, and so on. Here there are a list of concepts that most researchers agree on. Sometimes they use different terms to refer to very similar concepts, but it's the same way. It's the same approach. They operationalized walkability into a list of characteristics or concepts that enable and encourage people to walk. And they all needed to go through this process of a theoretical, operational, and computational definition. So just to give you one example, Alfonso, who is one of the first researchers talking about these walking needs, already um, provided these concepts of feasibility, accessibility, safety, comfort, and pleasurability, which for her are the main things that make a place more or less walkable or improves the walkability of a place. And then she presented the factors or the indicators related to each one and give a formula or a value to measure them. Um, Going back to this theory of walking needs or this hierarchy or pyramid of different concepts, what I'm going to do for the rest of the presentation is to talk a little bit about some of these concepts. I'm afraid I might leave you with more questions than answers because, as I said before, some of them are quite rather complex concepts, and I'm just going to give you a few ideas about them that you might want to consider for your policies. Walking feasibility, it's usually at the bottom of this hierarchy of walking needs. It's just whether a walk is feasible or not. And there are two main considerations here. If you see the picture with the highway, some elements of the built environment might make the walk totally impractical or impossible. For example, if you live on one side of the highway and you want to go to a grocery shop on the other side of the highway, they're actually something like a 200-meter apart, which is a walkable distance. But because of the highway, maybe the only real way of crossing it is 5 or 6 kilometers on one side and 5 or 6 kilometers on the other side, which makes the walk impractical or impossible. And there are many other examples of elements of the built environment that make a walk totally impossible or impractical, even if apparently they are close by and within walking distance. Um, Another important thing is the need to consider the personal abilities and lifestyle responsibilities and so on, and also the work context. This is really relevant not only for walking feasibility, but for other concepts that I'm going to present now, such as accessibility, safety, and so on. So a walk that is feasible, or a walk that is safe or comfortable for you, it might not necessarily be feasible, safe, or comfortable for another person based on their age, gender, or ability to move and interact with the public space. Um, so for your policies, it's really important that you consider the different needs and different concerns of all types of pedestrians, um, not only in feasibility, as I said, but in the rest of the concepts. Walking convenience can be related to comparing walking to other alternatives when moving around the city or your region. Um, and this opens some new approaches in your policies, because on the one hand you can make walking more convenient, or you can make another means of transport such as private cars less convenient, and then therefore walking would be a better option. A clear example is here in Braga. We were discussing that there are a lot of parking spaces. It's really easy to park in the city, in the center of the city, and therefore most of the residents, they choose to drive to the city center and leave their cars in the parking. Um, if parking in Braga were more difficult, maybe less spaces or more expensive, then driving to the city center might become less convenient, and then walking would be a more convenient alternative. Um, Another way of looking at this walking convenience is to combine walking with other alternatives as well. And the best example is public transport. So at the same time you are making driving to the city center less convenient by decreasing the number of car park spaces or increasing the price of it, if you provide a good public transport system that people can combine with walking, then walking becomes a much more convenient way. The combination of public transport and walking. And a last example about the convenience of walking, it could be in the potential of walking as a way of doing more than one thing at the same time, about combining multiple purposes. For example, you can, in this example, people are going to university, they're commuting on foot. So first of all, they're going to point A to B, so they're going from home to the university. At the same time, they're doing exercise, moderate physical exercise. Maybe they're doing their 30-minute walk, which we all know how good it is. And at the same time, they're doing some social activity. They can talk to the partners or people who are also walking to university. So these are the things that we can highlight in our policies and make the most of it, because I think that walking is the only means of transport that can do these all things at the same time. You can do some exercise on the bike if you ride to the university, but it's rather hard to keep a conversation with someone while you're um, um, on the bike. And on the other hand, you could socialize on the bus or in a car, but you won't be doing any exercise. So the only way of commuting, doing some exercise, and having the pace and the time to talk to someone, it would be walking. And I could have added here that if you walk back home and you can run some errands because there are some groceries nearby and so on, um, walking would be definitely a really convenient way of going to university because you are doing many more things at the same time. Things that you might not be able to do in if you choose another means of transport. Walking accessibility, at least from the research point of view, have very different approaches. Um, and sometimes we use different terms such as proximity, accessibility, affordability, and so on. Um, the most common um, approach to assess walking accessibility is based on walking proximity. The distance to specific destinations is what we all know about the 15-minute city, so that you are able to reach specific destinations within a 15 or 20-minute walk. Um, but there are also um, considerations on accessibility at the street level, and they're usually more related to inclusive urban design, universal urban design, which is also really relevant um, to provide accessibility. And then a third layer of accessibility, it's related to the actual quality of the service that you are accessing on foot. So, for example, in this image, there are two things here. It's a very long queue at a bus stop. So, living close by a bus stop, it might be considered really good for accessibility. If we're only looking into the first type of accessibility, the 15-minute city, if you live within 5 minutes to a bus stop, it will be great. But then you need to look into the actual service of the bus stop, and if the frequency of the bus is really poor, or the bus doesn't really takes you to the place you want to go, then the accessibility is not as good as it might be implied. Another example is this coffee shop. If the price of the service that you want to access is really unaffordable, then it's not really accessible either. So these are all different things to consider when you are trying to create a policy that gives or improves walking accessibility. Walking safety and research also has three different concepts. We have safety from traffic, and it's mostly related to vehicle pedestrian collisions. Then we also have safety from just health hazards while walking. The most common ones are trips and falls, but there are now increasing hazards while walking and using the public space, which can be related to the environmental quality. So walking under poor environmental conditions such as noise or air pollution, it can be also a risk for safety. Um, and then the third type of safety, it's personal security, which is related to crime and the sense of insecurity. Um, I'm not talking about how to measure or which tools to use to measure this yet, but one consideration when looking into these different types of safety is that it's not only important to for a city, it's not only important to be safe in terms of no accidents and no crime, but it's also important to feel safe and to have the specific elements um, that make a person feel safe, regardless of the actual activities happening in their place. Um, and just to finish with this list of concepts, while the previous ones, safety, accessibility, feasibility, might be considered as basic walking needs, these walking comfort, enjoyment, attractiveness, vibrancy, sense of belonging, and so on, might be considered just an extra to improve the overall satisfaction of walking and an overall walking experience. Um, and these concepts are usually more related to the extra quality of the public space, such as the greenery of the area, and also the street furniture. But it's also related to the people in the place, and the social interactions and social behavior of the people. And finally, it's related to the socio-economic activities and cultural activities taking place in the street, and like these open markets or live music and so on. After seeing all these concepts or indicators that we can use to define the walkability of a place, I'm going to use the last minutes of this presentation to talk a little bit about how to actually measure these things, how to use specific tools and variables to measure walking accessibility, walking safety, and so on. Indicators and variables can be objective or subjective, quantitative and qualitative, and they are at different scales. They could be static or dynamic, and they can come from many different sources, from institutional data to crowdsourced information. This is based on the rather complexity nature of walkability and all the things that are involved. Um, but before I give some examples, I wanted to tell you that there are many people working on this specific thing about how to measure walking indicators, and one great example is Daniel Sauter, who has been dealing with walking, measuring walking for 2 decades, together with Walk 21. And I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, the Walk 21 YouTube channel, where you can find 1 hour video in which Daniel talks about how to measure walkability from using global indicators and common sources. And he's using this similar framework that we're using for this type of project, in which we look into activity, safety, accessibility, comfort, and satisfaction, and gives a different level of indicators that can be used to systematically measure walkability. In this case, at the national level, but it could also be applied at regional or city level. Um, so going back to the concepts we just saw, some tools to measure walking activity are um, travel surveys. They're usually done by governmental institutions, in which they ask citizens how much they walk in terms of time, distance, frequency. They also ask them about the destinations, and more things related to the work context, and also the personal characteristics of the participants for the survey. So this is really relevant and important information about walking activity that you can access in your cities and regions. Another example is the emerging technology on video and image recognition that is being currently used to understand walking activity in public spaces. So it's a rather new source of information, but is really relevant for research. Then, if you see this map with a lot of light, it's a crowdsourced map of London, I believe, and that shows where people walk. and where people don't walk. This data comes from Strava, I think, which is an app to record physical activities, sport activities, but it's also being used for commutes as well. And this data can be filtered, and you can just get data on walking or cycling, but within walking, you can see walking as a recreational activity, as a commuting, and then you can filter by the pedestrian profile, for example. So really relevant information. And lastly, I wanted to talk about this fact that nowadays um, almost all of us have a mobile phone with an embedded app that counts your daily steps and also more variables related to walking activities. So this is all a new emerging type of very important and valuable data on walking that it can be used for research and eventually for policy planning on walking. If we look into the safety here, I also wanted to take the opportunity of walking safety to talk about three different types of data that can be also applied to any other concept, such as accessibility, comfort, and so on. So for safety, one type of data that researchers use is objective data or events, and examples can be traffic accidents and hospital and police reports, which gives you an idea of what's happening in the place related to safety or security issues involving pedestrians. Then we can also look into research-led audits. So in this case, this has a kind of two steps. So the first step is when researchers look for specific things on the environment, the public space, that influence pedestrian safety or the sense of safety. So in this case, they're monitoring some the heart rate and all the body data, and using some VR approach, so the person feel that it's walking in a specific environment and having a specific reaction. And then researchers identified which elements of the public space influence safety or the sense of safety for participants, and then come up with a list of things to measure or to look at the public space, and then create some audits. And then those audits will guide you to go to the study area and look whether this place has these specific elements or not, and their quality or characteristics of those elements. Then the last example is subjective data or experiences, um, whereas the research-led audits, it's more a top-down approach in which researchers come up with the things that they need to measure, and then they go to the street and measure them. These subjective data or experiences can be done in a more bottom-up approach with participatory mapping tools and involving communities. So this walk and roll map is an example of a community mapping tool, participatory mapping tool, in which people can share near misses, experiences in which they were almost hit by a car, or they almost had an accident, or they had some kind of security or safety issues, and they can report that on the map. And then we also have there the Walkability app, which I will explain a little bit more in a minute. But the Walkability app is also a participatory mapping tool in which people can share their experiences, and after they say if the experience is positive or negative or safe or unsafe, they can identify the elements and characteristics of the public space that created or influenced such experiences. And finally, you can see there it's a walking diary for school students. So in that case, I think it's a project in the UK in which students walk to school, and then they have the first minutes to write down their experience when they walk to the school. These are all really relevant types of information that we can gather to better understand walking safety. Each type of data has uh, um, its potential, it has its strengths, but also limitations. And the best way forward is to combine them and get a holistic approach or a holistic view of the safety of a place by combining objective and subjective data and top down and bottom up approaches. Um, Looking into accessibility, as I said before, there are two main ways of dealing with accessibility: proximity, walking proximity, and also universal design. So these are just two examples. For walking proximity, researchers usually use GIS, Geographic Information Systems, which is a software for spatial analysis. So you can calculate catchment walking areas um, um, with the pedestrian network. You can assume or calculate and walking average pace, and you can calculate the area that the person can walk within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and more. And then you can look into the number of specific destinations within such catchment areas. In this way, you can see how the walking accessibility of a place by understanding how many different destinations or opportunities people can reach within a 10 or 15 or 30-minute walk. I added here Plan for Better because it is a research institution that is doing great job in terms of studies on accessibility. And then another example for universal accessibility and inclusion is the Sidewalk project. It's an online application that you can access from your computer or phone, in which you have an interface with Google Street View, and you can identify different architectural barriers or issues for accessibility, such as, I don't know, crossings without ramps or obstacles on the way. And they have a set of predefined categories that you can use to select or identify issues and give them specific information and categorize them. And finally, I added this 880 cities project, which is from Canada, which is also really related to this universal accessibility and inclusion, but not necessarily from the point of view of universal design. Um, this project is called 880 because what they say is that if you plan a city for an 8-year-old child and an 80-year-old senior or older person, you will virtually design in a city for everyone. If you take into consideration the needs and concerns of children and older population when planning and creating policy for walking, you will be somehow considering the needs of most of the population. You can access the website of Plan for Better Sidewalk or 880 Cities. They have a lot of resources and more information about this type of methodologies to measure walking accessibility. If we look into walking comfort, there are a lot of audits that researchers use and are increasingly being used also for policy. Um, these audits usually include not only things related to comfort, but they also look into safety and accessibility as well. Um, and you can use them as a whole package, or you can just use the specific sections that are related to comfort in this case. And finally, to measure overall satisfaction or to measure more subjective or qualitative aspects of the walking experience, we have these participatory mapping tools, and this is the Walkability app developed at Walk21. Um, we will talk a lot about the Walkability app in our next session in Rotterdam when we talk about involving citizens, because we are going to use the Walkability app there in a community project. So I'm going to leave this for the next session, and I'm just going to finish this presentation with a socioecological model for walkability research. This one was developed by myself for my research, but it's a combination of existing models. And it has three main parts. So we have the environmental determinants, then we have the walking experience and the walking behavior. So normally the environmental determinants influence the walking experience, and then the walking experience influence the actual walking behavior, whether a person chooses to walk or not, and how much they walk, and the type of routes that they choose. So if we look into this graph from the end to the beginning, the walking behavior is usually the main aim of your walking policy. The main aim is to have more people walking more for longer. Um, but we've seen in this presentation that you can not really achieve this unless the walk or the environment where these people walk, it's convenient, it's accessible, it's safe, comfortable, and so on, which is related to the walking experiences. And the only way to improve these experiences is looking into the environmental determinants, and this is where the policy and planning process take place, because you can somehow improve the place in your cities and regions, and you can target specific needs and concerns from your population for the people, and look into specific work context that will make different things of the environment more or less relevant for the working experience. So this presentation and all these concepts are for you to understand how proper policy and planning with specific policy actions and aims and so on, looking into the environmental determinants, so looking into your place, your people, and the work context that happens in your place, will hopefully improve the working experience of your citizens, or the working experience of the people working in your cities. They can also be tourists and other type of pedestrians. And only when you improve um, the walkability of the place, and you make it more safe and more comfortable and pleasant and so on, then you can achieve your policy vision, which is increasing walking activity in your cities and regions. Um, I just have one last slide, but this is more related to how our walkability app it's linked to this theoretical framework or this socio-ecological model, in which we look into people, then the work context, then the place, and we give and we create information and knowledge for to assist policy and planning. But as I said before, this is something that we are going to look into in our next session. This is just a teaser about the Walkability app, and that will be all. Thank you, and see you in Rotterdam.